So there you have it. Thank you so much for watching today's video on the False Hydra. What do you mean? You just watched it? No? You're sure? Because I'm pretty sure you just watched it. Anyway. For whatever reason that you're watching this a second time, thank you so much for joining me for another Monster Monday, a series where I draw a creature from D&D, and I talk about its lore, and its history, and what it's like to fight in-game. For these videos, I like to use your suggestions for monsters that you'd like to see me draw, see my interpretation of, and hear the lore and mythology of as well. The top 10 most popular of your suggestions, which I compile in a list, so if there is a monster you'd like to see me draw, make sure to leave it down in the comment section. And that list I hand over to my patrons every single month over on Patreon, who not only help me make these videos every single week, who are very, very fantastically supportive people, so thank you very, very much for your contribution and for building our little community over on Patreon, but also they get to vote on which ones of your suggestions they'd like to see next. Now, today's topic of the False Hydra is probably one of the most popular in a very, very long time. Lots of people are very excited about this homebrew creature, but the first that actually suggested it was John Septic Lemon. So you have John to thank for this video, and my patrons for voting for it. So thank you so much for joining me. Let's get started again and talk about the mythology of this fantastic and eerie creature. So 2 warnings before we get started. Firstly, the creature I'm about to draw is an aberration. It's a fleshy, horrible nightmare monster, and I do not shy away from body horror. So while there's no explicit blood and things like that in this video, it still might be uncomfortable for some viewers. So if you're younger, let your parent watch first, and if general horror film stuff makes you feel uncomfortable, then maybe join us next week instead. The second warning is for my players. Those of you who play in my campaign, I'm sorry to say for spoilers, you're going to have to skip this one, because as much as I desperately want to share this with you, I may plan on using this creature at some point in the future, and while you're welcome to watch, you may want to avoid it for spoilers for our campaign. With that out of the way though, let's get started. Because I've been really excited to explore this creature ever since I first heard about the concept of it, mostly because I love my horrible flesh aberrations. A lot of you really like my gibbering mouther, for example, and that gives you a window into my appetite for creatures in D&D. But secondly, because I wanted to get to the bottom of why this creature is so particularly popular. It's not in any standard edition of D&D, it's actually a homebrew creature. But it's so strongly tied to Dungeons & Dragons, and so many of you have been extremely vocal about this particular creature, that I really wanted to see what the fuss was all about. Why did you guys love it so much? With this being a creepy homebrew creature, and due to its absolutely insane popularity, there are many different versions of this creature, but the one that's available on GM Binder seems to be probably the most popular and therefore the closest to being canon, I suppose, for D&D. So that's what I'll be using. As far as I can tell, the original concept for the False Hydra was created by Arnold Kemp for the Goblin Punch blog in September of 2014, where at least physically, its appearance seems to have been inspired by a creature known as Dead Hand, taken from the 1998 release of The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. God, was that long ago? For those whose nightmares weren't shaped by the playing of this game, Dead Hand was a mini-boss found in the bottom of a well in the Shadow Temple. The atmosphere here is intensely horrifying, as in order to encounter this creature, you are led into a dead-end chamber at the end of a dark corridor, in which several pale, wounded arms protrude from the soil below, all of their skin-torn hands facing palm upward toward the ceiling. Each of the half-dozen or so extremely long and very thin arms reach well over 8 feet high, dwarfing Link, the protagonist, as you enter the room. Reluctantly pushing forward into what is unmistakably a trap, a rusty iron gate shuts behind you, trapping you inside with a creature which emerges from the ground, resembling what's best described by the Legend of Zelda wiki as, quote, a flabby, almost tumorous mass of a body coloured in patches of something that looks like blood, with 2 tiny arms that terminate in sharp red spines rather than hands, and a head with a gigantic gaping mouth armed with huge teeth. Its eyes are black and expressionless. It's commonly encountered with infinite hands, and it's not known if the hands are part of its body beneath the ground or separate entities altogether." End quote. Kemp's False Hydra shares many of the same features that Dead Hand boasts, but he mentions specifically that beneath the soil it could have something more like a quadrupedal human body and something like a rigid spine-like tail. Owing to the name Hydra, Kemp's creature also tends to have multiple heads, attached to long, warped necks that resemble something like umbilical cords. Unlike a conventional Hydra, who gains heads as a response to harm in some sort of defense mechanism, the False Hydra instead grows additional heads in response to consuming living things, adding their biological matter to itself in order to gain more weapons to deal harm, more mouths to consume more matter, and thus a bit like a gibbering mouther, only increases its ability to consume more flesh and grow itself the more it kills. In its youth, starving for living creatures to engulf and absorb into its fleshy mass, it may only have 1 or 2 heads, but as its body swells with stolen tissue, it can produce as many as 7. As it matures and consumes more mass, it can redistribute this into more necks, which it uses to lash out at enemies, initially starting off with 120-foot reach with its heads, but eventually this squirming necrotic flesh mass can reach 1,240 feet apparently. But the massive scale of this creature and its massive appetite for destruction aren't even the most terrifying thing about it. In Kemp's original article, he goes into great detail regarding the most important and terrifying feature of these nightmare-inducing creatures in a section entitled Infiltration, which I'll quote for you here. He says that the False Hydra enters a town through a humble enough method. Fattening on worms, it has been growing upwards these last few days, perhaps weeks or years, but has only now broken through the soil. It emerges in a basement from behind the jars of fruit preserve, or pushes its face up through a broken cobblestone, and then it begins to sing. While it sings, it is ignored. It just creates gaps in your attention and then slips through them. It's subtler than invisibility and more reliable. Kemp describes this ignoring feature as similar to a very famous experiment and an accompanying video conducted by Christopher Cabris and Daniel Simons. You will very likely have seen this before, perhaps in a biology class when you were in school, or maybe as a sort of viral video. But for those who haven't, or those who need a reminder, the experiment, known as the Invisible Gorilla Experiment, features a group of people in brightly coloured clothes passing a ball to one another. They have one, I believe it's a basketball, and viewers are asked, in the mass of these people sort of running around each other and passing this one colourful ball, to try and count how many times the ball is passed from person to person. By the end of the experiment, people are fairly reliably able to give an accurate measurement of how many times the ball has been passed from person to person, and will find nothing unusual about the video. However, in the middle of this video, a person in a gorilla costume wanders onto the middle of the set and starts waving their arms. Almost all people who don't know that the gorilla is going to be there tend to completely miss it and have no idea that anyone in a strange costume has walked onto the set, because our conscious minds are observing and concentrating on the task of counting the ball, and the ridiculousness of this gorilla doesn't even enter our periphery. It's this same phenomenon that the False Hydra relies on in order to infiltrate its surroundings and consume nearby creatures, and it manages to create these gaps in awareness through its song. Further to this, the cursed singing of this creature's voice actually alters the memories of those listening to it as some sort of amnestic. Quoting again from Kemp's article, he says that the False Hydra's song hides the memories of the devoured victims in the same way that it hides the False Hydra, but this is not a perfect system. Wives will wonder why there are men's clothes in her closet. People will notice that no one has lit the street lanterns the last few nights. Churches suddenly find themselves without a bell ringer. By and large, these gaps close themselves up. The wife will forget about the clothes as soon as she stops looking at them, or she will conveniently remember how her brother left them there the last time he visited, or she will, on some level, recognize the wrongness implicit in the clothes and throw them away one moonlit night. She will confabulate powerfully and constantly, but part of her mind is cognizant of the disturbance. That part of her mind is distrusted and thus sealed away. But that primordial cluster of neurons still fires, a syphilitic madman who's been locked in the attic by his family, but whose mutters can sometimes be heard during the lulls in the dinner party downstairs. This creates pressure. In the early stages, this feels like paranoia, especially the sense that someone is watching you, and the Hydra is watching you, pressing its moony face up against the window and fogging up the glass. More severe symptoms develop. Reminiscing becomes a stressful and uneasy experience, and so is avoided. Distortions of memory. The confabulations pile up. Identities become muddled. Friends' faces seem subtly deformed. Human brains were not meant to bear this weight. Mundane insanities sprout like mushrooms, nervous disorders, and psychotic breaks. It's a truly horrifying monster that reminds me very much of the Silence in Doctor Who. Just like the Silence, you could perhaps have players awaken with tallies drawn all over their hands and arms, not realizing what they are, constantly seeing the False Hydra, realizing its horror, and then as soon as they look away, immediately forgetting it. Perhaps it's been following the party the whole time, waiting for those of them to become wounded, who fail their death saves, and then consuming those cast off. The players soon forget all of these people that they've killed, these allies who have fallen in battle or enemies, not disposing of any of their bodies, only one day to come across the realization, perhaps when one of them casts silence, that the deafening song has stopped and their memories begin to impact on their brains once again. Fragments of horrors that they've seen return to them. In the middle of the room sits the massive False Hydra who has been feeding off of their combat prowess. Now threatened, the encounter begins. It's a great way to deal with plot holes in your campaign that you've forgotten to seal up. Characters who have played a large part and you've completely forgotten to write back into your campaign could have been consumed by the False Hydra, and that's why no one remembers them. I plan on using such a creature in my campaign, and I've already started sowing the seeds of memory loss and confusing hints in characters' backstories that might indicate that a False Hydra is slithering around their nearby city. The deaf in the town who cannot hear this creature's horrific song can constantly see this beast, and therefore driven to madness. But what on earth is a creature like this actually like to fight? Well, as I say, I'm using the DM Binder homebrew version of this, but as this is a homebrew creature, there are many different versions out there. The DM Binder seems to me to embody Kemp's creation very well, and therefore I'll be using that as an example. Like I say, I've linked that in my description box if you'd like to use this creature for yourself. In this homebrew, the False Hydra is a challenge rating 14 creature. Unsurprisingly, it's an aberration, and a huge aberration at that. It moves incredibly slowly, as something that protrudes solely from the ground at 5 feet, but movement isn't its specialty. It grows in the ground like some sort of hideous flesh flower, and uses its long necks to attack from range. In a rule called Extended Neck, it says the False Hydra's heads have sickeningly long necks. Each head can extend several hundred feet from its body, depending on the age of the False Hydra. By extension, we're to assume how much mass it has eaten. A young Hydra with 1 or 2 heads has 120 foot range. An adult with 3 to 4 heads has 240. A 6-headed mature one can reach 480 feet with each attack. And an elder one with 7 heads reaches 1,240 feet with each attack. We're told that a head can recoil into its body or shoot out to the full range as a move action, and the head's movement can provoke an attack of opportunity, and all parts of the head and neck can be targeted if extended, which is rather better than just having a 1,240 foot range attack, because it means that players can cut these heads off, and thus stave off the attack of a False Hydra, which may want to recoil into the ground. Somewhat sickeningly, each of its many heads can speak both common and deep speech, which is even more horrific because it is an intelligence 21 creature with 19 wisdom and 24 charisma. It has 20 constitution and 20 strength, with its only weak spot being a hole in its dexterity, which is 10, which makes sense because this thing is reliant on its central mass, its body, which cannot move. As an unearthly abomination, it is immune to being charmed because goodness knows how this thing's brain works. But we know from each of its heads it's able to sense through blind sight without necessarily having the need for eyes so that it can sense through walls. Its main attack is a horrifying bite, which deals 4d8 plus 5 piercing damage, and if the target is the same size as the Hydra or below, so a huge creature or smaller, it's grappled by this thing's umbilical and spiny neck, taking a further 2d8 plus 5 damage as it is constricted at the start of each of its turns until it manages to free itself from this Hydra's neck, either through contact with its sickening skin or through one of its many necks. The Hydra can also make a separate attack known as Engulf, which allows the Hydra to consume a creature grappled by it through the bite attack. This follows many of the same restrictions that happen when a creature is eaten in general, but rather than being dissolved by acid damage, the creature who is engulfed takes 2d8 plus 5 bludgeoning damage, as this thing doesn't really have stomach acids, but they are constricted and mechanically digested by its jaws and its powerful alien muscles within. If an engulfed creature dies during this time, or is otherwise reduced to 0 HP, it is immediately consumed, and the Hydra gets an opportunity to grow one or several heads as a result. In a rule called Grow Heads, we're told that as the False Hydra eats creatures, it has a cumulative chance of growing a new head. For each creature size below, with an intelligence of 4 or higher, the False Hydra has a cumulative chance to grow a new head upon consumption. A tiny creature grants it 1%, a small creature has 3%, medium, so adventurers, is 5%, and large, or I presume above, is 8%. We're told that if the creature has class levels, increase the chance by 2%. For example, a small fighter would be cumulative 5% chance. If the False Hydra then ate a large wizard, he would gain an additional 10% chance, for a total of 15% chance to grow a head. And once a head has been grown, the percent chance reduces to 0. So it is really dependent on how much flesh surrounds this False Hydra. If you surround it with millions upon millions of rats, you could grow a head every turn with this creature. The False Hydra uses its horrific, amnestic singing as a weapon as well. It has an attack called Sonic Blast, which, like a dragon's breath, recharges on a 5 or 6 at the start of each of its turns, so it's very likely that it'll get multiples of these out of the way. But we're told that the False Hydra lets out a vicious scream, choosing which one of its heads produces that noise, and those within 60 feet of that head must succeed on a Constitution saving throw or take 5d10 plus 5 sonic damage, so thunder damage I suppose, and will be stunned until the end of the Hydra's next turn, unless they pass, in which case they take half damage and are not stunned. While this is likely to be a fairly infrequently used ability, the False Hydra is a legendary creature, and therefore has not only legendary resistance, allowing it to succeed on 3 failed saving throws of its choice, but also allows it 3 legendary actions, which it can use at the end of another creature's turn, one of which is using this Sonic Pulse. However, it's severely reduced in damage, dealing only 5d6 sonic damage, and it instead produces this as a 15-foot cone rather than a 60-foot area of effect around the head. It can also use one of its 3 legendary actions to make a bite attack, which makes this a fantastic creature to use in combat. One of the things I find most frustrating about 5th edition, which I absolutely adore by the way, it is my favourite role-playing system, but one thing that needs adjusted or sorted in my opinion, which I have homebrew rules for, is the problem of action economy. As someone who grew up with superhero comics and things of that nature, I like to present combats to my party where they face against one terrible monster or one humanoid threat, but a party of multiple people have many actions. And generally speaking, the side with the most actions tends to win out in a conflict in 5th edition, which you can subvert by throwing lots of minions to break up the initiative order, but the thing that makes a boss monster absolutely fantastic to me, rather than having a multi-attack on its own turn, which the False Hydra does not, is to have its main attack be one of its legendary actions which it can use in reaction to another creature at the end of its own turn. So each one of its heads can bite, but not as a multi-attack as the conventional Hydra would do. Instead, it gets to bite as one of its legendary actions. So it's an interesting dichotomy as a dungeon master. Do I bite more things to potentially constrict their movement and have an opportunity to engulf more players the next time I get a turn, or do I use a Sonic Pulse as one of my legendary actions to deal damage in a cone, potentially more damage than I would do with a bite, because there's always that chance that someone could escape the grapple and therefore avoid the constriction damage. This is a fabulously designed creature, in my opinion. Further to this absolute nightmare is a spellcaster using its charisma, i.e. I imagine its voice, to vibrate its horrific alien vocal cords at such frequencies that it can cast Detect Thoughts at will, and 3 times a day it can cast Dominate Monster, allowing it to easily engulf a willing participant in their own death. Its final attack is known as the Mind Song. It's horrific and amnestic singing, which is described to us as follows in these rules. We're told that the False Hydra sings a harrowing melody which is heard by anyone within 5 miles. Only one head needs to sing, and having additional heads join the song provides no benefit. Creatures hearing the song gain gaps in their memory. If a person enters a room with a False Hydra, the song will cause the person to forget the Hydra was there. This song does not alter reality, only perception. We are then given a quote about the wives' clothes and so on, but this is picked back up as we hear that, and I quote, "As people are victims to the Mind Song, they risk gaining split minds. The victim does not notice this, but the half of the mind that can still see but not hear may try to notify the victim of the Hydra. Each half only controls half the body. The half that cannot hear does not control speech. This may appear as the left hand inserting text into a note the victim is writing, or scratch letters into their chests as they sleep, very much like the silence from Doctor Who. Since the right brain is still impacted by the Mind Song, they may never notice the letter. However, the scars on their chests are harder to blank out of their mind." So the Mind Song allows the DM a get out of jail free card. If you're planning this to be a horrific encounter, if you want this to be a horror story, the idea is to use this creature like the big bad boss. You can have the players fight it multiple times, they'll forget, and you can always leave them clues, but the Mind Song allows you to escape and thus continue your story as all horror stories should. It fills the players with dread, and that's where this split mind concept comes in. It's not necessarily a rule, there's no condition, there's no wisdom saving throw here. The split mind is that players know, half of the brain, the player, will know that they are fighting a False Hydra and that it is trying to escape. The characters have no idea, they represent the other side of the brain, and it's a task for the players to somehow communicate to their characters or the rest of their party that there is a Hydra in the room without talking about it, and as if their memories have been wiped. It's a fantastic fourth wall break, which in my opinion is what the essence of an aberration should be. Aberrations are based on H.P. Lovecraft and the concept of extra dimensionality, something outside of your control, something outside of your conscious perception, creeping into your reality. This fourth wall break, I feel like, is a fantastic part of this creature. This meta knowledge being a second half of your brain makes this one of my favourite creatures of all time. And I have to say, probably actually my favourite Dungeons & Dragons creature. Unfortunately, I don't know the name of the person who created this homebrew. It was just on the GM binder. So if you do know, please make sure to credit them down below, and I will make sure that that is pinned to the top of the comments. But we can thank Kemp for creating this creature, and by extension, having a hand in this absolutely superbly, elegantly designed monster. So I hope you enjoyed today's video as much as I did. I got to draw my favourite kind of thing, some absolutely horrific body horror. I got to discover my absolute favourite creature from D&D now. It was all thanks to you. So thank you so much for suggesting great monsters. If there's another monster you'd like to see me draw, please make sure to leave that down in the comment section. Make sure to give this a little like, perhaps favourite this video if you'd like to come back to it later on, and share it with the rest of your D&D party. Maybe that's the hint that you need to let you know that your DM has been throwing one of these creatures at you all along, and NPCs are just going missing, erased from your memory as they are consumed by this horrifically intelligent and revolting beast. If you love this drawing in particular, and you'd like a copy of yourself, or you'd like to support the channel, generally in some supportive way, in a very personal way, I'll leave the link to my Patreon page down below, where my patrons get copies of my illustrations that I do each month, and various other perks, including having their names added to the end of my videos, and having things like one-on-one chats. Anything that you can do to spread the word of the channel really helps, as we are only a measly single-headed False Hydra ourselves right now, but are looking to grow into the horrific mass that we can become. I hope you'll subscribe so you don't miss out on any more videos from me. And until next time, always make sure to check your character in case they have any scars, new tattoos, or handwritten letters in their own handwriting, which might indicate that there is a horrific monster outside of their awareness, but standing right in front of them. And happy monster hunting.